Welcome back. We're talking about the temporary ceasefire in Syria. I want to rejoin our panel. Emma, Ashford, I want to widen this out just a little bit because if this ceasefire does hold or doesn't, the US still faces a big choice in Syria, which it's kind of been putting off, according to a lot of analysts, for a long time. There's been talk about a plan B. More weapons going in, or potentially a safe zone or a no-fly zone. Talk of its allies, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, getting involved. What are the choices here?
So I think a problem that a lot of people make is that they assume that inaction isn't a choice. And actually, I think the Obama administration over the last few years has made a very clear choice not to intervene in Syria. They've made certain small interventions, special forces, but almost all focused on ISIS, and they are not getting involved in the broader question of the Syrian civil war. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think one of the most dangerous things that we could see in Syria in the near future is the ceasefire fails and regional states like Turkey or Saudi Arabia go in and start to support the rebel groups that they've been backing with arms and money since this whole thing began. I think that would just increase the violence, increase the length of the civil war, and we don't end up in any sort of better place. Political negotiation really is the only way this is going to get solved.
Don't do stupid stuff, or words to that effect was one of Obama's. Alex, have the Russians done stupid stuff by intervening? I mean, US President Barack Obama warned that Moscow's involvement would end up being a quagmire. What's your view?
Well, I think it was a very timely intervention. I think basically, if not for Russia, we were looking at another Libya or another Yemen, by the way. People are now looking at what's happening in Yemen, and I think all these suggestions that the local regional powers can actually sort out this mess themselves without involving outsiders shows in Yemen that this is not a solution, and that it should not be even contemplated. I think all that talk about the plan B is mostly talk. With Russia's involvement, this plan B will not work at all. There will be no-fly zone. It's technically impossible with the Russians present there. There will not be any invasions by the Turks or by the Saudis, because they will be always looking at Russia. You know, things have changed on the ground in Syria and in the air as well.
Mohamad Ali in Damascus, that could be a possibility if we do not see peace talks progress, where Turkey, worried about its southern border, and Kurdish elements intervene. Saudi Arabia, obviously, and other regional powers backing various rebel groups. Would that escalate the conflict into a potential showdown between Western NATO-backed rebels and Russia, and of course Damascus as well?
Well, definitely, if the ceasefire fails and regional and Western countries decide to intervene on the Syrian ground with their forces, troop forces, definitely this would escalate violence. In the end, this is definitely a proxy war. All states who are supporting the various groups fighting on ground, they do have interests in Syria. Russia, however, when it started participating in the war on terrorism and fighting ISIL with the Syrian government, that definitely was a very important turnout and very important factor that changed the facts on the ground. The Syrian government forces started advancing significantly with the help of the airstrikes of Russia. But I don't think that the countries like Saudi Arabia or Turkey or the United States will be taking this decision easily now after the Russian participation, which is, of course, the decision of participating with troops on ground, because Russia now is heavily present in the Syrian airspace, and it has warned, of course, that it will not allow anyone to actually undermine its interests.
Emma Ashford, there is a slight problem here for the US and the West in the fact that Syrian government, as the sovereign government recognized by the United Nations, invites Russia in, and Iran as well. But if you have Turkey moving into sovereign territory of Syria, Saudi Arabia-backed militias as well, it could create a big showdown.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be very dangerous, and I think and I believe that the White House is very much trying to constrain our regional allies from doing that.
Is it having any success?
I believe so. The Saudis have been talking about needing a ground force in Syria very loudly for a month or more now, and nothing has happened. But they've also been relatively clear that they won't do it without some form of US support, and I don't think that's forthcoming. I think the big difference that we've seen is you're saying, well, the Syrian government invited the Russians in. That's why the Russian offensive in Syria has been at least moderately successful, is they have a single unified party on the ground to support.
And one objective, which is to keep...
Exactly, and the Assad regime might well have collapsed without that support. But for the US or for regional allies, it's a lot more difficult. Figuring out who to support on the ground, even if we wanted to intervene, is really difficult.
Alex, do you recognise this? Obviously, Moscow's siding with Damascus is a lot simpler than the US, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, all backing different rebel factions, some of which are all fighting each other. Someone called it a war of all against all. Is that what you're saying, Alex, from where you are?
Well, I think that this, you know, the presence of so many factions on the ground in Syria causes a major headache to everyone, not just, you know, America or Russia as well is sometimes getting frustrated. I can see the officials are trying to imagine how actually you can unite at least half of them, or I don't know, 1/3 of them to start the process going. I think the problem here is that like in any conflict, there's just too many agendas. And when there are too many agendas, somewhere someone either makes a mistake or does something on purpose which torpedoes the whole process. That's why this whole peace process is very vulnerable. And I think what is more important, to be quite perfectly, you know, frank with you, is I think the relations between Washington and Moscow will determine whether this ceasefire holds and whether there's any chance of a peace settlement in Syria. I hope China, by the way, which is always sort of keeping a distance here, but China has always been supporting a Russian position on the diplomatic solutions, on peace solutions in Syria. And I think China will play a part as well behind the scenes. And if that, you know, clicks together, then there might be a resolution.
I want to widen this out and basically ask what sort of Syria we're going to be left with. Mohamad Ali, you know, Syria was set up, as you know, by Western powers drawing lines on the map at the end of World War I. Is Syria going to look different after all this? Moscow has even talked about a loose federation recently, or will Syria have to remain whole?
Well, Syria is, the Syrian government, let's speak of the Syrian government, all of the war waged on Syria, all of the factors that are fighting Syria, the factions here on the ground, the Syrian government's main objective is first to defend its territories and keep Syria a united country altogether. Definitely the main important factor for the Syrian government and the objective is not just to defend Syria and defend its independence and independent decision, but also its territories, to keep it a united one. Definitely the Syrian government will not, in my opinion, will not accept any kind of division across the country, despite the fact that perhaps this is one of the agendas or aims of many countries who are against the Syrian government, like the United States, like Turkey, and like Saudi Arabia. The government, from my point of view, and according to what it has been saying, officials throughout the unrest, it will not stop fighting at any moment terrorist groups until securing the entire country, with the help, of course, of its friends like Russia and Iran primarily.
Emma Ashford, but on the ground, populations are divided, not just along ethnic lines, but also regional lines as well. Can Syria put itself back together again? People have been talking about the ghost of the former Yugoslavia, what happened to Iraq as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are severe obstacles to putting Syria back together. I mean, just from a practical point of view, we're talking about the Syrian civil war. We haven't really mentioned ISIS. They're occupying a large chunk of Syria, and that's a chunk that the government's not going to get back anytime soon. But here, you know, I mean, I'd like to push back against something that Alexander said earlier, which is, he said, you know, it would be so much easier if the US and its allies just accepted that many of these groups on the ground are terrorist groups. Well, actually, what this ceasefire is doing, or the cessation of hostilities is doing, is helping us figure out which groups genuinely want reconciliation, political change, a new government, and which groups are actually very aggressive terrorist groups like al-Nusra. And so the cessation of hostilities is actually very helpful for that.
Alex, do you agree with that? Because in a way, you do get a tally of who's buying into this process and who doesn't in terms of the cessation of violence. There's always been a disconnect between people talking in Ankara and what's going on the ground. Are we seeing an alignment of interest that may come round the table and negotiate a future Syria here?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't see really any alignment, and I don't see really that all the sides are now coming to some sort of a realistic approach. I mean, coming back to that point, how Syria will look after all of this, it will never be the same again. I don't really think that we will ever see Syria back as Syria as it was before the civil war, because you can see it, you can look at Iraq, you can look at Libya, and we realize that no, there's no returning. But what would be the best solution for a new Syria? That is another question. But unfortunately, I suspect it will take a very long time. And I just hope that, you know, a lot of people at the moment, a lot of diplomats and political leaders will take a step back, you know, with this cessation of violence and not interfere as they were doing before, and not play their hidden agendas and not trying to influence things and so on. Because this is the time, this is the chance to really start the process going. I don't see at the moment that the key players in the region, especially, are actually realistic. Unfortunately, no.